everyone. It's lovely to see you on this, well, for me, slightly foggy Monday morning. My name is Dr. Katharine Hoare. I work at the British Museum, and today I'm going to share with you the history of the museum, buildings, some of the artifacts, the objects in the museum, and some of the activities that go on. Now, as Malcolm said at the start, I love questions. What we are going to have time for today is an overview of the museum's history. So if at any point while I'm talking, you think of something that I haven't covered that you'd like to know about, or there's something you've always wondered about the British Museum, then just pop it into the chat box and we'll have a good Q&A session at the end. So during my talk, I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint with you, which will show images of the British Museum. These images are all in the public domain. We have a lot of information on the British Museum website itself about the history of the museum. And these objects also come from the British Museum archive. The museum has its own archive where it keeps a record of its activities since 1753, which was when the British Museum was founded. But we're actually going to start our story back in the 1660s. So I'm just going to pop up the start of the slideshow. And the other thing you will notice during our talk today is that I've got a little red pointer, because at particular points during the talk, I will be indicating areas in the image that I am talking about. And when I'm not using the pointer, it will just rest on the edge of the screen. So we started here with an aerial shot of the British Museum, taken in about 2005, and it shows at the heart of the museum, the Great Court. And as Camden residents, you might well have been into the British Museum building, and you will know now that the heart of the museum is the area known as the Great Court. And we'll be talking later about the development of the Great Court, which was a Millennium project. But the reason I've started with this slide is because during our talk today, I'll be using a lot of compass points. The British Museum actually aligns quite nicely with the 4 cardinal points on a compass. So we often talk at the museum about the front of the museum, the south, and that is the area of the museum that you will see if you are walking along Great Russell Street. And people usually think of that as the entrance to the British Museum. And this is the south wing. We will also be talking about the area at the back of the museum, which is the north wing. And in fact, the north area of the museum actually has several north wings in layers. And we'll be looking at the newest part of the museum's site, which you will have seen being built at the bottom of Malet Street about 2010. Having talked about the north and the south, you will then immediately realise that the next 2 points we're going to be using are the west wing, which is the area of the museum which you can't see when you're walking past Bedford Square because there's a line of Georgian houses, but behind that is what we call the west wing of the museum. And then on the opposite side of the Great Court, we have the east wing, and we're also going to be referring to 2 areas of the museum that, I suppose you could say, stick out at the front. The public never go in here. We've got the East Res, which actually is where I work. My office is in the East Res. And then on the opposite side, we have what is called the West Res, and that's where the director has his office. So I can wave at him across the forecourt. And the res refers to the fact that these used to be residents where people lived. And we'll look at that later in the talk as well. So during today's talk, you'll hear me talk about the north wing, the north of the museum, the south, the front entrance, the west wing, and the east wing. And you'll also hear me referring to some of the streets immediately around the museum, which you will know very well as Camden Residence. Great Russell Street, which runs in front of the museum, Montague Place at the back with part of the University of London and Senate House. And then we have Bedford Square to the west, and we have Montague Street running up the east side of the museum. So without further ado, let us start the story of the British Museum. Now, the British Museum, the building that you can see today, is actually Victorian, but the history of the site itself goes back to the 1660s. And in the 1660s, the 4th Earl of Southampton, who was the Lord Chancellor to King Charles II, bought 7 acres of land in what we now call Bloomsbury. And on those 7 acres of land, he built himself a house. And the house no longer exists. The first house that was built on the site was actually destroyed in a fire about 15 years later in 1686. And he then immediately rebuilt the second Montague House. So you'll often hear when people are talking about the history of the British Museum that it started off in a building called Montague House. And this is the building that you can see at the top of this slide. It was actually the second house on the site. We've got no evidence of what the first Montague House looked like. The second Montague House was laid out on the current British Museum site in a rectangle, actually very similar to the aerial shot we've just seen of the British Museum. The one change being that at the bottom, where we have Great Russell Street, Montague House was actually much nearer Great Russell Street than the current British Museum building. It then had a courtyard at the centre, it had a west wing, and it had an east wing, which you can see in the image above, being slightly lower than the main building. The main building would have been the aristocratic residence. The 2 wings would have been what we call service wings, where the servants would have lived and managed the aristocratic household. And then immediately surrounding the building would have been the Duke's gardens. This is the back of the second Montague House, and you can see that the gardens ran out behind the house and were laid out in a French style. And if you look right at the back of this image, you'll see the corner of those service wings that we were talking about earlier. So if you were there in the garden and you were looking towards Montague House, you would be looking through the house towards Great Russell Street. Now, the house itself sits here. This map is a map from the late 1600s, and it shows the area of London which we now call Bloomsbury. And you'll notice some of the areas that still exist. So we've got Bloomsbury Square, which is where we have the very large statue of Charles James Fox. And then going along Great Russell Street, you have Montague House. And you can see on this map the gardens behind Montague House. And then if you go further back behind Montague House itself, you will see that it's open fields. At this point in its history, Montague House was backed by open fields. None of the housing, which now lies around Senate House, had been built. And this area of Camden was well known for its pastures. There was a large dairy industry in this area of Camden. And in fact, Sainsbury's, which started in Camden, one of the earliest Sainsbury's stores was on Queen's Crescent, actually started as a purveyor of dairy goods because there were so many dairy farms in Camden at this time. This is what the front of Montague House would have looked like. Here we can see people on Great Russell Street. We can see the brick wall along Great Russell Street, which nowadays is where you see the iron British Museum railings. This is the gate into that forecourt, which we saw earlier. So this gateway is where the modern large iron gates are that you enter into if you're coming into the front of the British Museum. And then behind this gateway, there was a large forecourt. Now, the British Museum moved into Montague House in the 1750s. The British Museum collection was actually founded on the death of Sir Hans Sloane. Sir Hans Sloane lived in, well, the end of Great Russell Street, very close to Southampton Row. And in his house, he had accumulated a collection of objects, what is known as a cabinet of curiosities. Objects from the past, objects from the natural world, objects which he thought would help him and his fellow scholars to understand the world in which they lived. On his death, this collection was bequeathed to the nation, and it was decided to found a national collection, a national museum, the British Museum, which would house this collection. The Board of Trustees was set up, and the Board of Trustees decided that they were going to look for a suitable building in London that they could use to house the collection. One of the buildings that they considered was Buckingham House, which nowadays is Buckingham Palace, but it was considered that the building was in too bad a state of repair and was actually not in a suitable location for a national collection with the number of visitors that they would expect to want to access the collection. So instead, they settled on Montague House. Montague House at this point was not being used as a residence. The Duke had moved to his new Montague House, another Montague House in London, which he had built down by the side of the Thames in Whitehall. So he had moved out of the Bloomsbury Montague House, the house was vacant, and the trustees decided that they were going to purchase the house and turn it into a museum. So in 1755, with a purchase price of £20,000, oh, it'd be nice to have a time machine, wouldn't it? And pop back to 1755, £20,000, they bought Montague House. They then spent a further £30,000 on repairs and moved Hans Sloane's collections into the rooms. The museum was opened as a place for studious and curious people to view the collections. It was always intended to be free, but when it first opened, you had to pre-book a ticket, rather like you have to nowadays during the COVID-19 pandemic, where the museum has switched to a free pre-booked ticket system. This was exactly how you got into the museum in the 1750s. And you can also see on this slide the ticket that you would have collected from the museum, which was made out with the time that you were allowed to enter the museum, the date on which you could use that ticket, and also the name, the non-transferable name of the person who had had the ticket allocated to them. And I particularly like this one because it points out that there's no tipping. And that's a rule we still have at the British Museum. No member of staff is allowed to accept any money or gifts from visitors, be they academic visitors or members of the public visiting. So when you received your ticket, you would then arrive at that gatehouse on Great Russell Street, and your ticket would be presented to the porter. Now, this is a porter from slightly later. This porter had his portrait drawn in the 1740s. We know his name. His name is William Siver, and he is wearing what is called the Windsor uniform, which is similar to the uniform of the servants at Windsor Castle. And King George IV said that the security guards and the porters at the British Museum were allowed to wear a similar uniform. And this is now the dress uniform of security, which they wear if we have members of the royal family visiting the museum. Once you had presented your ticket and gone through that gatehouse, you then arrived in the forecourt. Now remember, this is the second Montague House. The museum is still in what was ostensibly a residence built in Bloomsbury. So as you went through that courtyard and arrived at the front door of the residence, and you can see the service wing still at the side, as you arrived there, you went into what to our eye looks like a rather grand National Trust house. The fabric of the building had been repaired, but the layout had not been changed. So all of the galleries were former living areas in Montague House. And as such, as you walked around the house, you would see objects on display in the rooms. Now, we're now looking at the area immediately behind Montague House, and we can see that even after the museum had opened, the area immediately behind was still open fields. And what you're looking at, if you look at the back of this image, is you are looking at the buildings that are appearing on what is now Southampton Row. Immediately behind the museum, in the 1780s, there was a military encampment. This encampment was set up as a response to the Gordon riots, which had taken place in London, May to June 1780. The government was afraid that there were going to be widespread protests across the capital, and therefore they stationed troops at strategic places across London. And one of these was immediately behind the British Museum. And this encampment stayed in place for 2 months and demonstrates to us how the gardens of Montague House are still extant. And then immediately behind the wall of Montague House, you have the encampment, which is on what is now Montague Place. So now this is the road Montague Place, and further back is where you would get to Senate House and the University of London, and then going further north, that would then take you up to what is now Camden Town, Kentish Town, even further north up to Hampstead Heath. Back inside Montague House, this is what visitors would have expected to see as they walked round. A collection of curiosities. Now, the curiosities had grown over the years to include collections either purchased or bequeathed by other late Georgian and early Victorian collectors. And you'll see that the collections at the British Museum at this point also include natural history. If we go back to the period of history known as the Enlightenment during Georgian times, scholars and academics were interested in trying to understand the world as a whole. There was not the idea of the individual subjects which we are used to studying at school nowadays. I suppose the only subject you could say that was separate was the study of the classics. But aside from that, the things that we might call chemistry, physics, maths, biology, were all lumped together as the natural sciences. And this included the outcomes of the human world, objects and artifacts that had been made and used by humans, and also the outcomes of the natural world. So plants, geology, and animals. And here you see a rather magnificent display of some stuffed animals at the top of the main staircase in Montague House, some giraffes, and just behind a rhinoceros. These collections are no longer at the British Museum. They are down at the Natural History Museum, and we'll have a little talk about what happened to the collections as the British Museum buildings developed in the middle of the 1900s. The collections grew to include sculptures, classical sculptures, the Townley collection. It also grew to include a large number of Greek vases brought off William Hamilton, who was probably most famous for being married to Lady Emma Hamilton, who was the girlfriend of Lord Nelson. Also, the British Museum brought collections of prints and drawings, and also collections of coins and medals. So in its early days, the museum was really acquiring its collections, not by going out and excavating or by buying objects from the existing legal art market and antiquities market, as we do nowadays, or indeed by commissioning new pieces, but by buying in whole collections from collectors who had spent a number of years previously collecting a particular type of object. Buying in those objects and also receiving gifts of objects from the Crown meant that very soon Montague House became overcrowded. An example was the Egyptian collections, which were bequeathed to the British Museum by King George III in 1802. And he had been gifted a set of Egyptian objects collected by Napoleon in Egypt, when Napoleon was then defeated in his attempted conquest of Egypt in 1798 by British and Turkish forces. All the antiquities that he had collected were confiscated. Britain said, those are nice, we'll have those. They were gifted to the king. The king was probably quite shocked and said, goodness me, I haven't got room for those in Buckingham Palace, and requested them or left them to the nation, and they were gifted to the British Museum. So you can see that the British Museum also became a repository for objects that are held on behalf of the nation. And that is still true today. All the objects held by the British Museum are held on behalf of the nation under an Act of Parliament which created the museum in 1753. So we can see part of the old Montague House here at the side of the image. And what you can also see is the building of a new British museum. In the centre of the image, you see what was called the Townley Gallery. This building no longer exists. But if you look further across and follow the red pointer, you'll see the beginnings of the building that we nowadays recognise as the British Museum. And this is the west wing of the museum. So we're right on the edge of the British Museum site. The entrance where you come in today is even further across to the right. And they've started work on the west wing, which in the museum today is a set of galleries. And then to the side of that, West Residence, roughly where the Townley Gallery was, which is where the director has all of his offices. And the forecourt of the British Museum has now been turned into a building site. Montague House itself, as you can see, is further toward the front of the site, and the British Museum, the new Victorian building, was actually built behind where the original Montague House had stood, much further back, which is why there's such a huge forecourt in front of the current building, and why there is room for those two large lawns. The Egyptian sculptures were some of the first objects that were moved into that new west wing. And we can see here what is nowadays a Gallery 4. And what we're looking at in particular is this object. Now, although all the objects in the British Museum now stand in buildings which are post 1850, some of the objects have actually been in exactly the same place since Victorian times. And this is an example. This shows the installation of one of our sculptures in 1854. And this, in fact, is one of the objects that was collected by the British Army after the defeat of Napoleon in Egypt. Interestingly, the French had already attempted to remove it. And on the sculpture, just here where the pointer is on the drawing, and just here on the sculpture, you can see a hole which we believe was drilled by the French army when they were trying to lift and move this object in the late 1780s. They failed in their attempt. The British succeeded in moving the object and transporting it by sea back to Britain. It was gifted to George III. He then gifted it to the British Museum, and here we see the army involved in installing it in the museum. This object is so large and so heavy, weighing over 7 tons, that the only people at the time with the expertise, the engineering expertise to move it, were the army. And so we see here an artillery regiment of Royal Engineers moving the object through the window. The glass would have been removed. The object would have been swung in through the window into the gallery space and was then raised onto its display plinth. And the gentleman in charge of the soldiers can be seen sitting down. This is Major Danzi. And in fact, we know that Major Danzi served at the Battle of Waterloo, where he sustained a leg injury, which is why he's the only person sitting down, while all the other soldiers are busy using their engineering skills, their levers and their pulleys to raise the object onto its plinth. And that plinth has stood there ever since, and it has never moved. And it probably never will, because it is extremely big and extremely heavy. Once the Victorians had completed the building of the new British Museum, it stood in a large hollow square. And if you go into the Great Court nowadays, you will be familiar with the large porticos which lead into the west side of the modern museum building. This is Gallery 4, where we just saw that Egyptian sculpture being installed. That is the north. That is where you now have the American collections going through to the China collections. This is the east wing. That is now room 1. We can't see the front wing because we are looking at the middle of that quadrangle. And when the Victorian Museum was built, the middle bit, which if you were standing where the red dot is nowadays would be the Great Court, was actually an open garden. So the centre of the British Museum was open to the air. And if you go into the Great Court nowadays, the walls that you are looking at, which to us appear to be internal walls, spent about 30 years as external walls, which is why they have a higher degree of weathering on them than you would expect for internal walls. This large area, this garden area that we were just looking at, there is the west wing. That is nowadays room 4 with the Egyptian sculptures. There is the south portico. That is where you would enter into the current Great Court. That area did not fare well. The garden was overshadowed by the wings that had been built around it. There was not enough sun really to sustain any sort of planting. And very soon the new building, which had been built to accommodate the growing collections, was itself starting to fill up. And one of the reasons the building got so full was that you'll remember I said that the collections included natural history, which nowadays are down at the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. The collection also included a huge number of books. And all the books which nowadays are up at the British Library on the Euston Road originally were housed in the British Museum. And as this book collection grew, so space ran out. The problem was exacerbated not by merely people gifting their books and their manuscripts, or books or manuscripts, collections of them being purchased, but by the fact that the King had granted the British Museum the right to receive a free copy of every single book published in the British Isles. And that was gifted from the late 1700s and continues to run all the way up to the present day, which is why the British Library is itself still growing, because every book that is published in the British Isles, a copy is sent to the British Library, which acts as what is known as a repository library. It's not a lending library. You can go and look at the books, you can't take them out, but it's guaranteed that any book that has ever been published in Britain, however long out of date or out of print it is, there will be a copy at the British Library. So going back to the mid-1850s, the museum decided it was going to use that central garden area to build a reading room. And here you can see what is nowadays known as the round reading room being built. The round reading room was built around 12 iron girders, which were driven down into the ground, which then supported at the top that dome, which sits at the centre of the Great Court. And you'll notice, I think health and safety will be a bit shocked here. We've got some workers on the roof of the dome setting in the girders, which are going to support the roof of that dome. Also set into the dome were a series of windows, which at that time would have let natural light into the central reading area. There was no electricity or gas in the British Museum, so all of the galleries and the new round reading room have large windows and skylights to let natural light in. And in fact, in the winter, the museum would close at dusk because once the natural light had gone, no one could see anything inside the British Museum building. Here is the inside of the completed round reading room. At the moment, there is no public access to the round reading room. It was used as an exhibition space for the Terracotta Army, which came over as part of an exhibition organised by Jane Portal and Neil McGregor when he was director. Since then, it is stopped being used as an exhibition space, but it is not yet again open to the public. But here's what it would have looked like in Victorian times. The central desks where the British Museum librarians worked, part of the collection of books housed at the British Museum, and then the readers' desks like spokes around the central librarian's desk. And this is a photo of the library as you might have seen it if you had come to the museum in about 2000, when all the books had been moved up to the British Library and the reading room was used as a public reading room, but for the British Museum reference collection rather than the national collection of books. The reading room was used by many notable readers. Anyone could apply for a free ticket, very much as you can nowadays at the British Library. A couple of the notable readers were Karl Marx and also Lenin. Karl Marx, we know, used it very much as his office away from home. So he would come to the reading room every day, would ask for books, particularly pertaining to politics and economics, would sit at one of the readers' desks, and this is where he collected his notes and drafted his book, Des Capital. Interestingly enough, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to visit the British Museum, he was taken on a tour and was taken into the reading room. And one of the first questions he asked was, "Oh, do you know where Karl Marx used to sit? I would love to buy his chair and take it back to Russia." We don't actually know where anyone sat. They didn't have allocated seats. We suspect that people probably sat in the same seat every day, in the same way that people often sit in the same seat when they go to a public space nowadays. People often have their preferred seat in a cafe or a library, but we don't know exactly which seat anyone sat in. Outside the museum, the front entrance then started to be augmented with additional public services. And one of the services that was available at the British Museum was free drinking water. And these fountains, which you can still see nowadays, but they're not operational any longer, were installed in 1860. and they were installed as part of a public health initiative across London. And they followed a series of major cholera outbreaks in the capital, which had killed tens of thousands of the capital's citizens and drove the government and a number of private organisations to work on an improvement of the sewage and the clean water supply across the capital. You'll see that the fountains have a little lion motif delivering the water. That lion motif is repeated on the front door, and those lions are still there today. They're often very shiny because a lot of the school children, as they walk in, give the lions a little rub on their nose. And nowadays, these fountains are non-operational. You can still see them. We've had to put a piece of perspex across the basin because we found that people were starting to use them as a repository for litter. But they're still there, but non-functional. Inside the museum itself and inside the new Victorian building, you'll remember I mentioned room 1. Room 1, which is on the east side of the current building, was one of the first galleries to be opened. And when it was first opened, it was a library. It contains a set of books which were gifted to the nation by George III, and it's known as the King's Collection, the King's Library. Those books can still be seen nowadays up at the British Library. If you go into the British Library, you'll see that right at the heart of the modern building is a stack of books which go from the floor to the ceiling. They run all the way through the different floors of the museum. And if you go, of the library, and if you go to the library cafe, you can actually sit right next to them. That is the King's Collection, which originally was housed here at the British Museum. Nowadays, Room 1 still houses a large number of books, but the books that we look after now are a collection of books which used to, well, still belong to the British Houses of Parliament, which are on permanent loan to the British Museum. So we still have a library, but the King's Library has moved up to the British Library. And room 1 nowadays, if you come to visit the museum, is laid out to demonstrate how the different areas of the world and history were collected by Sir Hans Sloane. So at the bottom of the gallery, we've got some natural history specimens, which we've borrowed back from the Natural History Museum, as well as archaeological objects, which are then reflected in the galleries across the rest of the museum. Here are some of those natural history objects on display in the British Museum galleries, as it was in the early 1800s, all the way through until the Natural History Museum was founded. In a similar process to that by which the British Library was founded, when the British Museum became too full of books, once the museum realised that the natural history collections were growing too large for the existing building, it was decided to found another British Museum of Natural History down in South Kensington. And that was actually the first museum that was built in South Kensington, before the Victoria and Albert and before the Science Museum, which came later. And the Natural History Museum, founded as an offshoot of the British Museum, they're no longer part of the British Museum, they're now a separate museum. But all of the natural history specimens were moved down to South Kensington in the 1830s through to the 1850s, leaving galleries free to then accommodate the main focus of the British Museum, which then became antiquities and human-made objects from the past. Here we see some of those antiquities on display in the British Museum galleries. And as we can see, rather like yourself, the museum has always been a focus for learning. You can see here a collection of Greek and Roman objects on display, Greek and Roman sculptures. And this is what is known as an Artist Day at the British Museum, when artists were allowed to come into the museum, set up their easels and sketch and draw the objects, something that still happens very much at the museum, not only for school groups coming in for art workshops, but we also have adults who can often be seen sitting around the museum sketching and drawing artifacts in the building. And then in the other image from 1881, we have a lecturer, a visiting lecturer, who is taking a group of students around the British Museum, instructing them on Greek, Egyptian, and we can see right at the back, Assyrian objects. So the British Museum galleries have always been used as areas where people can come and view our collection, because we're a national collection, and also where people can come and learn and where people can teach. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move to a 10-minute break, and we're then going to continue looking at the story of the British Museum, moving forward through the late Victorian period into the 20th century. So I will see you again in a few minutes' time.
Thank you, Katharine. That was very interesting. As Katharine says, we're going to have a 10-minute break before Katharine concludes her talk, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Thank you very much. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
Hello, hello.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we have now rapidly jumped to the year 1902. And here we've got a lovely photograph on the front steps, where of course you're not allowed to sit, but these gentlemen are, because this is the British Museum security staff in 2009. And this includes members of the local Metropolitan Police. And also you can see there are some members of the London Fire Brigade. They're the gentlemen wearing the flat caps. And nowadays the British Museum is designated as what is known as a 2-fire engine institution, which means that as soon as the fire alarm goes off, if the fire officer and security cannot find that it was a false alarm and the fire brigade need to be called, they automatically send 2 fire engines, and then additional fire engines will be added if needed, whereas most other fires would warrant the sending of a single fire engine to begin with. Inside the north wing of the museum, building continued. The British Museum is a building site. There is continually building happening somewhere on the site. And this is right at the back of the museum. And here we can see a photograph from 1913, which shows the construction of what is the Prints and Drawings study room, where people can apply to see any of the prints and drawings which are part of the British Museum collection, and then look at them on the reader's desk, which you can see in the photograph of the study room nowadays. The different cases that are being put up with the drawers housing the prints and drawings, some of those had previously been used in other parts of the museum. The museum is also very into upcycling, and some of these cases had started life in the late 1700s in the first iteration of the British Museum, and was subsequently moved in 1913 to new areas of the museum. The wing in which this study room sits is part of what is known as the King Edward VII wing. It wasn't actually opened by him. It took so long to build that it was eventually, although it was named after him, opened in 1914 by King George V and Queen Mary, who are sitting in this carriage, travelling in what nowadays is Montague Place. And what I particularly like about this is that some of the British Museum staff, if you have a look, they have assembled on the roof of the Edward VII wing to watch the proceedings and the formal opening of the wing. And nowadays, the windows that you can see here in this photograph, that is where nowadays we have the Chinese and the Indian collections in what is known as room 33, right at the back of the modern museum building. And right at the back, there's also the back entrance of the museum, which leads out onto Montague Place. This is another aerial photograph of the British Museum, but this time we're going back to the 1930s, and we can see where the red marker is. That is the Edward VII wing, which we just saw being opened in 1914. We can see the round reading room, which was built in the 1850s. We can see the four wings that we've been talking about: the west, the east, the south, usually known as the main entrance, the original north wing, with the Edward VII wing then built directly behind it. And at the back, we can see what is nowadays Senate House and part of the University of London. That was built in the early 1930s. Georgian houses in the area were cleared, and Senate House and buildings associated with the University of London were constructed in the 1930s and still stand today. And interestingly, Senate House was originally planned as the first of a number of houses or towers that were going to be built for the university, which were planned to stretch northward all the way up to the Euston Road. It was such an expensive building project that in the end, only one of them was built, which is the Senate House that we can see today. And what's interesting about this aerial photo from the 1930s is you can see that that roof is not yet over the Great Court. The roof that we see nowadays was not put in until 2000. And so the buildings in the Great Court are actually book stacks. They're part of the shelving housing the library, which nowadays has gone up to the British Library. So some of those walls that are internal are still external all the way up to the 1930s. Inside the museum itself, in 1929, we have the entrance hall. And at this point, all the retail options were in the front hall. So the shops, postcards, books were all available for purchase in the front entrance. You would have come in to the left of the photo, walked across what is nowadays known as the front hall, through, and this doorway would have taken you into the Great Court. At this point, because this area, which is now the Great Court, was the British Library, there would have been no public access through this door, and instead you would have gone straight into the galleries using what is now the cloakroom corridor, which takes you through to room 4 and the Egyptian sculptures. At the front of the site, we've talked about the east and the west res. Here are a couple of photographs showing you what was happening inside the east and the west res. The East Res, which is now offices where I work, was originally built to house staff who lived on site. It was where the British Museum librarian lived, where the porter and the security staff lived, and also where the house servants, the housemaids, lived who looked after the building itself. In the opposite one, in the West Res, was where the director lived. We've got a photo here of the director's residence in the 1930s, complete with a dog, and then part of the director's residence in the 1970s. This part of the museum is no longer lived in. Neil McGregor decided that as he had a residence in London, he was not going to use the West Res as a place to live. And since then, it has been converted into offices, and it still retains what is known as the director's flat, which is available for visitors to stay in at the museum if they're visiting for work purposes. But the director no longer lives on site. Continuing through the 1930s, the British Museum collection increases, and you can see at one point we had some of our objects out on what is nowadays the colonnade. This object, our Easter Island statue, is now inside the museum, behind what is nowadays the Great Court. Also on the forecourt, bay trees were introduced by the director of the time to give it a more garden feel. And inside the galleries, you can see that the Department of Antiquities, which had been set up, is covering all of the different objects from the ancient world. So nowadays we have a Greek and Roman department, an ancient Egypt department, an ancient Near East, the Middle East department. In the 1930s, there was one department, the Department of Antiquities, Hence, visitors could look at something from ancient Assyria right next to something from the Roman Empire or from ancient Greece. The 1930s, of course, ended in 1939 with the declaration of World War II. In August of 1939, being aware that war was likely, the British Museum started to evacuate some of its objects. Similar had happened during World War I, where the worry about airship attacks on the capital meant that some of the objects had been removed from the museum building and had been stored down in the tube. This plan was reenacted in 1939. Some of the objects were taken down to tube stations. We know that tube stations were used for civilian air raid shelters. They were also used as a place for storing British Museum objects and books and manuscripts, which at that point formed part of the museum holding. Some of the objects were too large to move, including that statue of Ramesses II, which we saw being installed earlier. So large numbers of sandbags were placed inside the British Museum building in the event of a bomb attack. The museum was in quite a vulnerable part of London because immediately north of the museum is Euston, which was a large rail hub. As you know, nowadays up at Silvertown, when you're going up past towards Mornington Crescent, there are lots of junctions, there are lots of rail lines in that part of Camden. So it was a target for enemy bombing. And the museum, being aware of this, had members of staff who acted as air raid wardens up on the roof of the British Museum. There you can see the roof of the round reading room. There you can see Senate House. The member of staff has got buckets of sand because the museum was particularly worried about incendiary bombs. This is an incendiary bomb that actually fell on the museum during the war. The incendiary bombs would pierce the roof. Inside the incendiary bombs was then a number of smaller fire lighting devices, and it was these fires which would cause the most damage. The museum did sustain quite a bad bombing on the night of the 10th and 11th of May, when incendiary bombs came down through the roof of the reading room and also other areas of the museum, destroying the fabric of the building and also some of the objects. We've heard that a lot of the objects were taken out of the building or put into deep storage. A small number of objects were left on display. The museum was open at the beginning of the war. It closed later, but as part of a morale raising initiative, a number of objects known as the Sacrifice Collection were put on public display and were indeed sacrificed and destroyed during the bombing. As well as the objects and the fabric of the building, there was quite a lot of damage to the books. And here you can see books from what is nowadays the collection up at the British Library being dried in room 33. If objects weren't damaged by the bombs or the fires that they started, they were damaged by the water used to put the fires out. And particularly vulnerable to that are paper objects. And the fire brigade putting water onto the roof of the round reading room to put out the fires then started a trickle down effect, which sent water onto the books stored below. And quite a lot of the books were lost or very badly damaged by the water from putting out the bombs, as well as the areas of the museum that were destroyed by the bomb explosion and also the fires. Moving forward to the end of the war, we see a picture of the front of the museum taking us now into the 1940s. If you go down to the museum site today, you will see on some of these front walls that there are still bits of evidence of that bomb damage where explosion has pitted the surface of the walls and it has been left to accompany the official war memorial, which is on the colonnade of the museum. Post-war, numbers of visitors visiting the British Museum increased. And here we have a couple of photographs of the queue for the 1972 Tutankhamun Exhibition, probably our most well-known exhibition. It is still the exhibition which has attracted the largest number of visitors in the museum's history. It was visited by over 1 million people, including myself as a small girl with my mother. I have looked at this photo, I can't see myself in there, but the queue for people visiting it was so long that it not only covered the forecourt, but stretched out onto Great Russell Street itself. And of course, one of the highlights of this was Tutankhamun's gold mask, one of the rarest objects in Egyptian antiquity, which nowadays is housed in the National Museum in Cairo, and nowadays is never going to leave Cairo again. So this was one of its last visits overseas to the British Museum in the 1970s. It's now deemed too fragile and too valuable to leave Egypt. We know that in the middle of the Great Court, which was open to the air, a lot of the space was filled up around the reading room with book stacks, huge bookshelves. This area was known as the Iron Library, and here's a photograph of the Iron Library. So wrapped around the reading room itself were huge metal bookshelves, each with their own individual little roof. So it was like a patchwork of mini bookshelves, book stacks, each with its own little roof, miles and miles of shelving, which housed all the books and manuscripts which are nowadays housed up at the British Library. And looking at this photograph, we can see the colonnade, the centre of the museum, we can see the north wing and the Edward VII wing. Interestingly enough, we can date this photo because if you look a little bit further, no Senate House. So this photograph was probably taken between 1914, when this wing was opened, and the early 30s, when building Senate House started. So probably a photograph from the 1920s. When the collections moved up to the British Library on the Euston Road, it freed up a huge area of the museum, and all those bookshelves were taken down. And instead, the modern Great Court, which we see today, was created. Once the bookshelves were removed, the Great Court space opened up, and then all those piecemeal roofs, which disappeared when the book stacks were taken down, were replaced with a single roof to create the current Great Court. The outside of the reading room was housed in Portland stone. Previously, the outside had been surrounded by those bookshelves. When the bookshelves went, the iron girders were exposed and are nowadays surrounded by a new wall installed in 2000, complete with stairs taking you to the upper galleries. And here in this photo, we can see one of those porticos, which in Victorian times was open to the air, nowadays is undercover. And that is the doorway leading into the Egyptian Sculptures Gallery 4. The museum itself is the listed building, but although we cannot touch any of the fabric of the original building, so here you can see we've got Victorian barriers up on the balcony. They do not pass modern health and safety standards, so no members of the public are allowed on the upper balconies, and very few members of staff are as well. But these fixtures and fittings are protected because we are a listed building, as are the doors. But we are able to make changes to the space in each of the rooms, and here you can see room 2 being fitted out with new cases in 2005. So although the museum building has remained the same, galleries have been reworked over the years, and there is always a new gallery, the latest one being the refit of Gallery 33 at the back of the museum, which was refitted a couple of years ago. The other area of new build at the museum is the area that you'll see down the bottom of Malet Street. This is the area that used to have the British Library Bindery. It also had the British Museum photography studio. When the British Library moved out, the bindery was knocked down The photography studio, which actually, although it looks quite old, had been built in the 1960s as a copy of a Georgian building, was also knocked down. And now at the bottom of Malet Street, we have the World Exhibition and Conservation Centre. This was built in 1910, and as well as having 3 floors above ground, this building also has 3 basement levels. So once the old buildings had been cleared, the British Museum then discovered what lay underneath the British Library binder and that 1960s photographer studio. And what we found were walls and gardens from the Georgian period, which had once belonged to the terrace of Georgian houses, which runs immediately outside the British Museum. And this area had been their gardens. We found garden walls. We found wells that had been covered over. We then continued digging down because we had to excavate 3 basements worth of soil. The further down we went, the further back in time we went, we also discovered pits of cattle bones. And you'll remember I said right at the start that this part of Camden was used in Georgian times for dairy farming. And what we think these bones represent are cattle plagues from the 1700s, rather similar to the modern day foot and mouth, which necessitated the destruction of dairy herds in the area to stop the plague from spreading. And just as with modern foot and mouth, the remains of the cattle were then buried in the ground. We dug down further and remains of the Civil War trench, which was dug around London, were also discovered. Carry on digging down, excavating down 3 levels. Here you can see the bottom of Malet Street, and you can see the 3 levels of the museum building that go down into the basement. So as we excavated down, you'll know that in archaeology, once you've excavated, you can never redig. So unfortunately, from an archaeologist's point of view, total excavation is total destruction, and all of that area of soil and those cattle bones have now been lifted and are part of the modern scientific research laboratories at the British Museum. Also in this area of the museum, we have our new exhibition centre, which opened in 2014 with the Vikings Exhibition, the largest exhibition area in the British Museum's history, which means we can have much larger exhibitions than we ever previously have, and we can have much larger objects in those exhibitions. And I just want to finish our talk by talking about something that actually disappeared with the building of the exhibition centre and the Great Court. The Great Court really started the process. There was so much vibration and so much dust and so much coming and going with the building of the Great Court and then the exhibition centre that one of the losses were the number of feral cats that lived on the British Museum site. We can see here one of the most famous British Museum cats. This is Mick. When he died in the 1930s, he actually had an obituary published in the newspaper. Here we see 3 of the last British Museum cats, and the last one to live on site, who was still living there when I started work at the museum in 2000, was Pippin. They were kept on the museum site to help control the mouse problem. They were cared for by members of the British Museum Cat Society. And it was only when Neil McGregor arrived as director that it was decided that there would no longer be any British Museum cats on site. And so nowadays, all that is left are a number of signs around the British Museum basement saying, "Feed the cats here. No more cats on site." We've now gone into lockdown. The British Museum is closed. I hope you'll be able to revisit when we reopen in December. We are busy looking after the objects, keeping the galleries clean, ready for your re-arrival. I hope very soon that this is what the forecourt will look like again. We've now come to the end of the talk and we are moving into the Q&A section. So any questions you have, I will be more than happy to answer. Over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Catherine. That was absolutely fantastic. Really, really interesting stuff. Just before I do the Q&A section, I've got one more poll for you to have a go at. And then I'll collate up the questions together and put them to Catherine. So let me Here we go, launching poll number 2. There's 3 questions altogether. If you could just do those for me, that'd be very kind. I'll leave the poll open for another 30 seconds or so, just to give people a chance to do it. Just while we're going through that, Susan says, I shuffled my way around the queue to see the Tutankhamun Exhibition in 1972. I may have been next to you, Catherine.
You never know. We may have been in the same space at the same time. They say that everyone in the world is connected by 6 steps. I think you and I may have 1 step to each other in that case.
Right, I can see people are still voting, so I'll give you another 20 seconds, and then I will close it down. Then I'll ask Catherine the questions. Cool. Okay. So let's go through some of these questions. Susan asked, are there any maps, photographs, etc. in your presentation available for educational use in schools?
What an excellent question. What I would suggest is that there is a lot of information on the British Museum website itself. There is a short history of the British Museum, which has some photographs that I deliberately didn't use today so that you would have additional material that you could then go and look at. The other thing is to look on the British Museum Collections online database, which is available through the main British Museum website, and you can search for objects from the British Museum and also photographs of the British Museum. The other place to have a look is if you go onto Twitter, you'll see that our archivist, who's called Francesca Hillier, has her own Twitter account. It's a public British Museum staff account, and she very often tweets photos from the archives, which include things like pictures of the old British Museum admission tickets, pictures of old readers' tickets from when the British Library was at the museum. So it's worth looking on there, and those are all public domain photos. So I'm going to be honest with you and say, just do a cut and paste. If it's on the website, it's in the public domain. If it's on a staff Twitter feed, public domain, just copy the photo and use them. Spread the word.
Excellent, good. Next question, how can you find what the British Museum holds?
Oh, that is an excellent question, because of course what we hold has changed quite considerably over our history. A lot of our current collection is represented on the Collections Online database. And the Collections Online database was relaunched when we launched our new website about a year ago. If you go onto the main museum website and you go to where collections, there's then a very simple search engine into which you can enter any word. So you could enter a culture, so like Egypt, Greece, Britain. You can enter a particular type of artifact like pot, sword, drawing. There's then different search criteria, so you can go for particular dates, and that will pull up a lot of images of our collection with a small amount of information, and there are over 1 million objects on there, and it's representative of what we hold in our collection. It's absolutely fascinating. Once you get on there, you'll be on there for hours looking for different things. I use it a lot at work.
Excellent. Is it true the British Museum had its own tube station?
Yes, it did. It did. And a lot of staff still talk about the fact that we would love it to be reintroduced. There are various rumours that it was immediately underneath the British Museum. That's actually not true. You couldn't catch a tube and then go straight up in the lift to your office. It was down near where nowadays there's the Holborn tube station. There were a couple of tube lines that ran underneath Kingsway and through what is now Holborn, where the big Sainsbury's is. And it was decided in the 1930s that the stations would be amalgamated because they were very close to each other. And so that all of those lines were then amalgamated into the modern Holborn tube station. Some of the lines that the trains ran through then stopped being used, and that is where the objects were stored during the war, because as you know, not all tube lines have trains running through them, and there are a number of derelict, well, no, I wouldn't say derelict, a number of unused stations. The one that I particularly love, which you can see as a Camden resident, is between Mornington Crescent and Camden Town. If you're sitting on the Northern Line and you look really, really carefully, it goes through an empty station that's no longer used. And at the bottom of Camden Road, there's actually the old building where you can still see the arches. It's now used as modern shops. So there are a number of derelict stations in Camden, and the British Museum one is one of those. It's underneath modern Holborn.
Good. How long has the British Museum had a gift shop for?
Oh, what an excellent question. The British Museum enjoys offering people retail opportunities. Now, the early visitors to the museum were actually taken around as escorted groups. You were only allowed to go in by yourself in the way that we do nowadays, much later on in its history. So to begin with, when it was in Montague House, there was no retail opportunity. It was only when the new museum was built in Victorian times and then moving into the early 20th century that the idea of having a gift shop evolved, and that shop originally was in the front hall. When we saw that photograph from 1929, that was where the first gift shop was in the early 20th century, which has then grown into the number of gift shops and cafes across the whole site nowadays.
God. Is it true you can see the British Museum on Google Street View?
Yes, you can. That is another excellent way to look around the museum. If you go to the British Museum website, we call it a virtual tour. Basically what happened is about 3 years ago, Google Street View brought their little robots into the museum first thing in the morning before the galleries were open to the public. And over a number of weeks, their little robots went round all the galleries. So it's actually a snapshot of the galleries from 3 years ago. But yes, you can navigate just as you do Street View outside, all your way around the lower and the upper floors of the British Museum. So yes, you can do a virtual tour at any time during lockdown or when we're open. It's on the main museum website.
And the final question I've got is, are you still collecting objects? And if so, what things have you recently acquired?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Yes, our collection continues to grow. In fact, interesting enough, our collection continues to grow so much that we've got storage houses, storage areas off site in London, and we're building a new one out at Reading for the archaeological collections. Nowadays, the British Museum collects its objects in a slightly different way. In the past, so if we're going back to pre-1920, if the British Museum was excavating anywhere around the world, there was often an agreement with the different countries that some of the objects excavated would stay in that country and some would come back to the British Museum. Nowadays, most countries do not allow antiquities to be exported, even where the excavation is being run by archaeologists from another country. So that's the case in Egypt. No antiquities come across from Egypt from excavations that we do. So a lot of the objects that we acquire nowadays are either gifted to us from private collections, or they are purchased from the legal antiquities market and the art market, because there are a number of objects circulating which are legally allowed to be sold, and they have a provenance, which is what we call the history, the known history of an object, so we know it hasn't been looted or stolen. We also collect contemporary objects, so we collect from contemporary artists in particular. Prints and drawings are still collecting. We collect objects which we feel are representative of the modern history of cultures. So one of the most recent modern objects that we collected was a battery powered torch, which was being used in Africa in areas where there wasn't a mains electricity supply. So the curators are continually adding to the collection, looking at where we've got gaps in the collection, trying not to replicate where we already have objects, so that our collections continue to grow and represent the world, not just in ancient times, but also as we go forward. So sometimes we'll have a theme. So there was some collecting around the theme of communism after the collapse of Eastern Europe, looking at historical processes which we think will be of interest and importance in the future.
Fantastic. Well, an excellent answer. I like that. It was very nice. I think we'd all like to say thank you to Katharine for a wonderful talk. I'm sure we're
most welcome.
All clapping at home to say thank you for that.
Thank you.
Just to conclude, the next talk will be on the 7th of December, which is Meeting the Tudors, their impact in British history. Then we miss a week, and then we come back on the 21st with gift giving in the Neolithic times. If you want to come to any of those two talks, sign up the same way as you came to this talk, and hopefully we'll see you then. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.